Service level management. Knowing what you pay for. The network provider provides a product to a customer. In this case, the product happens to be a networking service. The customer is expected to pay the service provider for the networking services provided. Unlike many other products, networking services are often highly customized to meet individual customer needs. In addition to its function, an intrinsic part of a service includes its technical properties such as performance, capacity, and availability. Those properties are collectively referred to as the service level. Service level agreement. An SLA defines the technical terms of the service that is being provided. The targeted service level, in addition, it includes business terms such as precise terms of what will happen if the agreed to service level is not met. Here are some of the things that you will learn after reading this chapter. The first, understand the components of a service level agreement and how SLAs are defined. Second, get to know examples of service level parameters. Third, discover what business considerations need to be factored into defining service level agreements. Next, learn how to plan and manage a network for a given service level. And last, understand how management techniques are applied to monitor and validate service levels. Motivation for service level agreements. The relationship between the providers and the beneficiaries of networking services are typically business relationships that are accompanied by business arrangements. The network provider delivers a product and the customer is expected to pay for it. Products are generally defined as not just by their functionality but by other characteristics. Let's make some remarks of service level agreements. Okay? Here's number one. Service level agreement SLAs should match. The business needs and expectations should match because in the end of the IT needs to provide services to the business so the business can run its business processes and achieve its business goals. SLAs should not be used as sticks but as measurements and improvement tools. So it's not about like walking each other around the years. It's about like, hey, we are able to achieve its target. How we are going to improve it together. SLA service level agreements must be supported by the appropriate OLAs or operational level agreements and UCs underpinning contracts. They all need to come together so in the end you can provide like an end-to-end service to the customer. And last but not the least, service level agreements are the basis for the managing the IT to business and business to IT relationship. It's all about building and it's all about formalizing those bridges and those like relationships. The characteristics of a product determine to a great extent the value you will be able to derive from it, how much you will be willing to pay for it, and whether you even want to buy it in the first place. Identification of service level parameters. An important decision about SLAs concerns what parameters to use to define the service level objectives. A parameter in an SLA must meet three criteria discussed in the following subsection. First, significance. It must be significant and meaningful for the service that is being defined. Measurability. It must be measurable and objectively verifiable. Service level parameters that service level objectives are based on also need to be measurable. It must be possible to determine whether a service level objective is being met or violated, and to do so in a manner that is practical. The whole purpose of the SLA is to define what constitutes an acceptable service level in a clear and verifiable manner. If the actual value of a service level parameter cannot be determined, defining corresponding service level objectives becomes pointless because it would be impossible to tell whether they are being met. By the same token, if a parameter can be measured but the cost of doing so is prohibitive, that is higher than the benefits of making sure a corresponding service level objective is indeed met. For all practical purposes, it can be considered fairly useless. Although this seems like stating the obvious, how to measure service level parameters is a problem that is often far from trivial. This particular aspect is discussed in further detail in the section on service level monitoring. Second is the relevance. It must be relevant to the context in which the service will be used. As mentioned previously, a service level parameter that is to be included as part of a service level objective in an SLA must meet the three criteria. Significance is the first. Relevance is the second. It is not sufficient for a service level parameter to be significant in terms of it defining a characteristic of a service. In addition, a service level parameter must also be relevant, that is, important enough to be included as part of a service level objective in the SLA. Not every parameter can be defined and that relates to a service as to be included in an SLA. In fact, it can be counterproductive to include too many parameters because they need to be also monitored and enforced. If parameters are included that are not really relevant, they shift attention away from those parameters that truly matter and tie up resources that might better be spent otherwise. Which parameters to include is often highly dependent on the context in which the service will be used. Consider the example of an SLA for data connectivity service. If the connectivity will be mainly used for the file transfers to perform payroll processing, it makes little sense to define service level objectives that relate to jitter or end-to-end delay. On the other hand, if the same data connectivity service is purchased by a video service provider that intends to stream live TV or over the link, the same parameters could very well be of high importance and should be included. A parameter might also not be relevant when it is simply not expected to be a factor. For example, when any realistic service objective based on that parameter is highly likely to be met anyway. Its inclusion in an SLA could be pointless. An example concerns the BHCA parameter that we just encountered for voice service. The number of supported BCR calls attempts might very well be relevant to a large enterprise, in which lots of intra-office calls are made and questions might arise about whether the underlying voice network will be capable of handling such volumes. However, chances are it that chances are that it is not However, chances are that it is important for a voice service for a small business. There will simply never be an intra-office call volume that is high enough for that parameter to be a factor.
Defining a service level agreement. An SLA needs to answer a number of questions. What will the service provider deliver? What are the service level objectives? How will service level objectives be tracked and verified? What will happen if the service provider fails to deliver? An SLA should specify other aspects as well as such as who the contacts are and the terms under which the SLA is allowed to be changed. However, the previous item constitute the most crucial aspects and are discussed in more detail in the following subsections. Definition of service level objectives. When deciding which service level objectives to include, you need to make a number of considerations. 1. Determine which service level parameters and which service level objectives are really critical to your needs. To identify candidate service level parameters, remember that they must meet the criteria that we just discussed in the previous section of being significant, relevant, and measurable. Furthermore, you need to think about what target levels are really required. Second, be as specific as you can be when defining service level parameters. Clearly define the terms that you use and what they refer to. State any assumptions about context as appropriate. And finally, be realistic. As a service provider, you should enter into SLAs only with objectives that you fully expect to keep. SLAs are fundamental cornerstone of a trusting relationship with the customer and express a confidence that the agreed upon service levels can indeed be met. You should never enter an SLA expecting not to keep it, only because, for example, the defined penalties are deemed acceptable. Likewise, as a customer, you should be aware of the implications of service level objectives. Asking for things that are obviously unreasonable is asking for trouble.
Tracking service level objectives. In defining service level objectives, you need to also be clear about how those will be verified and how the underlying service level parameters will be measured. This is important not only to avoid disputes, it can also help identify any misunderstandings about what the service level parameters entail. Here are considerations to take into account. First, be clear about where parameters are measured. For example, if you have a service level objective for an application hosting service by a data center that concerns response time, by stating where you are measuring, you are also clarifying what are you measuring. Second, be clear how parameters are measured. That is, what measurement techniques and methods are used. Will actual production traffic be measured? Or will additional probes be used that inject test traffic? In some cases, there could be a question about how to calibrate measurements. For example, if you measure packet delay between two different points in the network, how do you make sure that you are adequately capturing the difference between the time the packet was sent and when it was received? If you use the local time at each end, questions about the accuracy of such measurements could arise. Make sure that measurements are statistically relevant. Whenever measurements have to rely on sampling, another question concerns the confidence that you have in the statistical relevance of the sample. Taking too many samples is often not feasible because of the additional load that measurements and test traffic impose. Finally, it should be clear who measures and how your measurements can be verified. In the earlier example, an outside party will not have access to the incoming and outgoing firewalls ports and will not be able to actually measure T5 plus T6 plus T7 plus T8 plus T9. The best that it might do it is to measure T4 plus T5 plus T6 plus T7 plus T8 plus T9 plus T10. The assumption is that T4 and T10 should be negligible and hence the two are the same. But what if they are not and what is depicted as a link between the internet service provider and the data center turns out to be an access network in its own right, which introduces a non-negligible delay. In anticipation of this and similar situations, the service provider sometimes includes access to service level statistics to the customer as part of the service itself. In some cases, an independent party might be called on to certify service levels. Dealing with service level violations. Despite all the best intentions of everyone involved, the possibility exists that service level objectives will be violated. To prepare for such cases, a good SLA needs to clearly spell out what will happen in such an event. Think of it as a prenuptial agreement between network provider and customer. What happens in case of a service level violation involves several aspects, each of which should be addressed in the SLA. First, restoring the agreed to service level. This is what needs to happen first. Of course, think of this as the emergency response plan. An SLA might spell out a committed plan of action for how to restore the agreed to service level in case of violations. The plan of action should include commitments such as following. First, inform the customer when a service level violation is detected. Second, provide the customer with regular updates on the current status of problem resolution at specified time intervals. And third, take adequate action to respond to a service level violation within a certain time interval. And last, restore service levels within a certain time interval. The second aspect is make up for service level that was not delivered. Of course, even the most responsive reaction to a service level violation and the quickest restoration of service levels do not change the fact that a violation of service level objectives did indeed occur. In essence, a part of the product was not delivered as promised. An SLA should therefore spell out any penalties to make up for that fact. Those penalties can range from a temporary reduction of service fees to much higher penalties, such as reimbursing the customer for the impact on the business. Typically, penalties are capped at a certain amount that is calculated to be in reasonable proportion to the price of the service. Penalties should be defined on a scale that takes the following into account. First, the number of violations. Second, the severity of violations. And last, the particular service level objective that was violated. And the, and the third aspect is reconsidering the future business relationship and possibilities for bailout. If service levels are constantly not met or severely violated, it could be an indication that the service provider is simply not fit to live up to the terms of the SLA. For such cases, it can be important for the SLA to contain an escape clause that specifies the conditions under which the service contract can be terminated prematurely. Better an end with horror than a horror without end. Clearly, a customer wants to avoid being caught in a business relationships that obviously does not live up to expectation, even if the service provider offers penalties. Ultimately, the customer is not after penalties, but being provided service at the level that is required to run the business. Managing for a service level. The SLA also needs to be delivered. This involves a number of aspects. The service needs to be set up. When the service is operational, it must be constantly monitored to ensure that service level objectives that were promised are being met. Statistical data must be collected as proof that the agreed to service level is being delivered. Decomposing service level parameters. Service level parameters are influenced by the different parts that realize the service. Service level parameters can accordingly be broken down into each of the components that factor into the parameters as a whole. As a service provider, it is therefore important to understand the different pieces that a service consists of and, consequently, the various factors that contribute to a service level parameters. Several potential benefits to this greatly facilitate service level management. It helps in diagnosing the root cause for missed service level objectives or for unobserved degradation of service level parameters. It is easier to assess the impact of a failure in the network on a service and to identify which services and SLAs might be affected. It provides guidance to plan and design the network for a given service level. And last, understanding the different pieces that contribute to a service level parameter can be helpful to devise a strategy for how to monitor it.
Planning networks for a given service level. The first step towards successfully meeting service level objectives consists of setting up the service properly so that the service level objectives can be met. This involves identifying the services and network resources that the service will be mapped onto and provisioning them accordingly. However, applying the proper configurations so that the service is functionally is only one aspect. Just as important is ensuring that enough resources in the network are available so that service level objectives will be met, which could involve reserving those resources. Dimensioning networks to meet service level objectives. When dimensioning a network to meet service level objectives, it helps to decompose the service into its individual components, as discussed in the previous section. Subsequently, the required dimensioning for each component is established, depending on its role and contribution towards meeting service level objectives. How to dimension? That is, to determine which and how many resources to allocate for a given service instance is perhaps the most crucial aspect in provisioning a network for a particular service level. The most straightforward way is to simply reserve all the resources that are required if the customer always uses the service to its fullest capacity. This way, barring unforeseen failures, the provider of the service will never violate any service level objectives. It turns out that, in reality, users do not generally use their services all the time or to the full extent of the capacity they purchase. Managing oversubscription risk. Of course, subscribing network resources can be risky. At times, every user might simultaneously access the service. In such cases, something will have to give. Also, sometimes the usage of service between different users may not be as statistically independent as the service provider would like. Depending on the service providers can use a variety of techniques to migrate those risks. For example, reprovisioning. In the course of monitoring current service levels and service consumption, a growing problem related to overusage often can be detected. In such cases, the service provider might be able to temporarily increase available capacity in some circumstances. Another is imposing admission control. A service provider might be able to impose a scheme in which users do not access a service if usage is above a certain level, and admission of more users would lead to deterioration of everyone's service level. The idea is that sometimes it is better to make one or a few users unhappy instead of everyone. Service level monitoring. Setting up early warning systems. When a service is up and running, it needs to be monitored and ensure that it is running accordingly to specification, that is, without violating any of the service level objectives. Impending problems should be detected early enough that there is still enough time for countermeasures. Service level monitoring can accordingly roughly be divided into two aspects. 1. Monitoring service level parameters, and 2. Detecting when problems are about to occur. Monitoring service level parameters. Different techniques exist for monitoring performance and quality of service level parameters that are the subject of service level objectives. Analyzing management information. This includes the following: NetFlow and IPFIX records, which contain a lot of information about network flows. SNMP, MIBS, which include many objects with information about device state and device performance, and which therefore may be regularly polled for this information. Silog messages, which could indicate certain problems in the network management information that is readily available, specifically operational data and state information, as well as logged events. Offers a wealth of information that is relevant for service level monitoring. Of course, in many cases, information about service level parameter is not available directly, specifically when end-to-end parameters are involved. Interpreting the management information that exists and trying to ded- ded- deduce service level from it can sometimes resemble forensics. Once again, knowing how service level parameters are decomposed into different components and which statistical data factors into it can greatly facilitate this task. Passive measurements. In some cases, operational performance statistics that would be really needed are not readily available. In such cases, special management tools might need to be introduced into the network with the specific purpose of observing network traffic to take certain service level measurements. This often involves using a separate device, a sniffer, that attaches to the network and sniffs what is going on. Sniffing often involves inspecting packet headers of network traffic for what they contain in search of certain patterns. In this way, packets that belong to one particular application, a voice or a video stream perhaps, or a data transfer can be identified and various measurements can be taken. Active measurements involve injecting test traffic that stimulates a service user with the specific purpose of measuring service level parameters. In a network service setting, active measurements involve a probe from which test traffic is generated, just like traffic that would be generated from a legitimate service user. The traffic is directed as a second probe on the other side of the network that receives the test traffic and records the observed results. In some cases, where the parameters involve round-trip performance, the remote probe might also simply reflect the test traffic back to the sending probe and let the sending probe evaluate the performance. In this case, the remote end is also called a responder. A very simple yet famous example in networking for this concept is the Internet Control Message Protocol, echo request better known as a ping. This enables a network manager to ping a remote destination and measure the time until a response is returned. Anticipating problems before they occur. Being able to monitor current service levels is nice, but when it is detected that service level objectives are violated, the damage is already done. Therefore, it would be nice to also anticipate a problem before it occurs. This way, it might still be possible to take countermeasures to avert service level objective violations. Accordingly, what is needed is a service level forecast, not unlike a weather forecast, of course. In this case, the course of forecast events can still be influenced. A number of techniques can be applied to anticipate problems before they occur, including the following. First, trend analysis. Users can regularly poll or collect critical service level data and track it over time using mathematical extrapolation techniques, it is possible to establish a trend to predict the most likely scenario if current trends continue. Second, anomaly detection. Often service usage patterns and fluctuations in service level that are observed repeat over time. In many cases, but not always, this is a consequence of human behavior. Service level statistics. It's finger pointing good. In addition to monitoring and ensuring service levels, it is also important to keep a record of the service levels that are experienced over the course of time. Why? Because such a record can improve of tremendous value if a dispute between service provider and customer occurs. That's why historical service level statistics are often also referred to as a finger pointing data. If a customer complains to a service provider about service level violations, the service provider might simply admit to it to keep the customer happy. The service provider might even provide the customer with the statistics that enable the customer to make a claim in the first place. In some cases, service level reports are a part of the service package. However, a service provider might not always be so forthcoming. In such a case, it can be tremendously helpful for a customer to have a record of what service levels were observed at what time to back up the claim. Likewise, if a service provider feels wrongfully accused, it can be tremendously helpful to have a record that proves to the customer that service levels are indeed adhered to. After all, the service provider has a reputation to defend, and build a reputation of violating SLAs can severely impede future business. As in other walks of life, if two people can settle a disagreement out of court, all the better. However, if a matter does not need to go court, hard evidence rules. Here are the most important aspects to consider. 1. Are the collected samples statistically relevant? 2. Does the collected data indeed accurately reflect the service level parameter it is supposed to contain? Third, is the data authentic?
Okay, that's all for the service level management. Um, we are the group 11. Thank you for watching.